It's a very relevant point, a point that a lot of overseas investors are not advised on, and this is where we come in to help our clients structure their assets. So to begin with, there isn't any reliefs available for residential property, whether you buy it personally or through a company. However, there are structures that we can put in place to help reduce the exposures over time.
Well, in this instance, the value add amounted to roughly 10% over and above the gross of his purchase price, buying costs and renovation costs. We sort of target closer to 15%. That's what we sort of aim for, but it's that sort of range which is, I would say, is realistic. And there's a real opportunity, I would say, in the market to create this sort of uplift in real terms, because in times gone by you'd be competing with small to medium-sized developers. The 15 to 20% return on investment, that's a classic developer target to create.
Today we're discussing the case study of a high net worth Saudi Arabian investor in prime central London property. I'm going to set up the scenario in a moment, but first I'd like to come to my two guests for a brief introduction. Welcome to you both.
Hello.
Hello.
So Hugh, it'd be great to hear a little bit more about your background and how you assist clients in property matters.
Well, I started my eponymous firm, it's called Obbard Limited, some 30 years ago. And we set out to advise investors into the London market, and our focus was always on value creation. So so we've grown as a company over this time frame, and we now do use the term a one-stop shop. So we source property, we renovate to add value, we let, manage, long-term asset manage, and we oversee disposals of the property. So we do the whole A to Z, if you like.
Fantastic. Great to have you with us. Zeeshan.
Yes, so I'm a chartered tax advisor focused on advising clients with a tax-efficient structuring, both across the UK as well as advising internationally mobile clients with their international portfolios, and also Middle Eastern families investing into the UK.
So just to set up the scenario, Mohammed, aged 52, a Saudi-based entrepreneur and family office principal, married with 4 children aged 18, 16, 14 and 11. Mohammed has built and sold a successful logistics and distribution business in Saudi Arabia and now manages the family's diversified investment portfolio through a private office in Riyadh. Working with their wealth manager in London, the family was seeking prime central London acquisition with clear investment criteria, scale, value add potential and long-term capital growth. The family takes a highly selective approach, focusing on opportunities where enhancements could materially increase both enjoyment and capital appreciation. 2 of the children are considering UK university education in 2 to 3 years, making London an increasingly relevant long-term base for the family. The family typically spends 8 to 10 weeks per year in London across multiple visits, summer holidays, half-terms and business trips. Mohammed acquired an exceptional lateral flat, approximately 3,500 square feet on one of Mayfair's prime garden squares, a rare opportunity in a sought-after location that rarely comes to the market. It's recently been valued at £15 million. The property had strong fundamentals, but required substantial modernisation and reconfiguration to meet the family's requirements and contemporary luxury standards. Mohammed undertook a comprehensive renovation programme, including full structural reconfiguration, systems upgrade and specification to hotel-grade luxury finish. The property will be held long-term as the London base, with potential to form a foundation for a broader UK property portfolio that they're interested in exploring further. So Hugh, let's start with the fundamentals. Mohammed was looking at prime central London with his family's long-term use in mind. What makes a Mayfair Garden Square acquisition compelling for a family like this versus a purely investment-based strategy?
Well, first and foremost, Mohammed was introduced to us by his bank, and we introduced ourselves to say that we would be able to find him the opportunity. We, as with all clients, it's a dialogue. You start to understand their needs. I think is where we're very similar. So on the one hand, there is a tax structuring and how are we going to own this or how are we going to finance it? From our point of view, it's understanding what is the ultimate purpose. So it was quite clear cut. You've summarized really what it is that they were after. And so first and foremost, our job is to source and find that property, which we were able to do. It was an off-market situation. It was bought at a substantial discount to what it had previously been on the market for. And as part and parcel of our advice, and enabling Mohammed to make the decision to proceed, we did full cost planning, full assessment with our own internal QS on the likely costs, the timeframes, what could be achieved before plans and after plans. And so Mohammed was able to have a fully informed basis in which to proceed. And thereafter, which we'll probably get onto, we executed the entire strategy of the renovations and the long-term asset management and holding of the property.
So on the acquisition, you mentioned sourced off market. I mean, what's the value add here of working with an agent versus traditional estate agency routes?
Well, I think it's necessary to point out what to me is the obvious, but some people don't quite grasp, is that estate agents are paid by the seller. Their professional obligation is to get the best price for the seller. Their incentive is to get the commission from the seller. So a buying agent acts totally on the other side of the coin. We act for the buyer. Our motives are to do the opposite, is to get the property at a lower price. The other thing is that there's a lot of information out there on portals, etc., and there are a lot of estate agents out there. So if you go to one estate agent, they will sell you a property that they are instructed to get commission on. You can obviously go on portals and have a look and go and approach other estate agents. But within Kensington Chelsea Borough, I think there are 360-something estate agent offices, something like that. So a buying agent is looking at everything and everything, first and foremost. But then there's another element, which again, people might not grasp, is there is what you might call a grey market, where quite a lot of property is sold off-market, agent to buying agent. This is how the commercial world works. It's very rarely anybody buys a commercial property where there's representation on both sides. In the residential world, in London, this is becoming increasingly more the case. In fact, there's a mail shot list going around of buying agents, and it's about 420. There are a lot of buying agents, but buying agents get access to the whole market, and most importantly, off market, and they are value driven for the buyer.
Is also the location relevant here, i.e. he's not living in London able to operate and transact quickly? Do you think
100%. It's a very tangible investment you're making here. So you've got to literally sniff the air and feel it. So absolutely. So, and again, when you compare what an estate agent does and what a buying agent does, an estate agent is there to enhance and promote the pros. A garden square, Mayfair, lateral, what's not to like? But the cons are much as more important, arguably, than the pros. So, lease length. London has a complicated leasehold system. What's that? Service charges, outgoings. What are they going to be? What can you do to the property when you buy it? What does the local listing of the property and conservation area mean you can and you can't do? I mean, I could go on and on and on.
And just on that point, on renovations, what kind of improvements really move the dial in prime central London?
Well, to move the dial, you need, I mean, in simple terms, you need to really add value. The property that you create has to not really, well, it has to bear a relationship with what you bought, but it has to fundamentally be look and appear as a different property. So a simple cosmetic uplift in order to make it more livable will add a degree of value, but it won't be fundamental. But taking, for example, a property which hadn't been renovated for 30 years and reflects how people used to live in a time gone by, people want much more lateral space, as it was here. They want much more open space. There is clients of ours coming from the Middle East or the subcontinent increasingly want a bathroom with every bedroom, and they want a big bathroom with every bedroom. Those are just sort of, then you have people who work from home. We're doing a house in Bayswater for a Saudi family who were very traditional, and they want separation rooms. These are things that add value in very specific ways to very specifically to each unique property.
So talk to us a little bit about why this property was unique. 3,500 square foot lateral on a prime garden square. Why did Mohammed have to act quickly? What was the dynamics here?
Well, he had to act quickly because we didn't want other people to know that the seller was actually in need of a sale and would have taken such a big discount, which they were prepared to do. The price was around 15 million a purchase, and it had been on the market closer to 25. They were hoping to get 20, but 15 was the figure we ended up with. The thing that this market makes is quite enticing and exciting, quite frankly, is that the opportunity to find these sort of assets is actually much greater than it has been in all my experience of 30 years plus. This is one of the best addresses in London. In fact, it has recently, last year, I think it hit the highest price per square foot, which is on a new development on one end of the square. So, and lateral space in London is not easy to find. A lot of London properties are converted period houses, etc. But so 3,500 square feet is big in London terms. So, and it was in the centre of the square. So position, address, opportunity to add value, just general rarity of these assets being available usually because people just hold them for long-term family legacy, what have you. It was a real box ticker and he recognised it.
Fantastic. Well, Zeeshan, just to bring you in on some of the tax points, Mohammed's profile as a Saudi-based, non-UK domiciled individual. Take us through the immediate tax considerations when he was looking at this property purchase.
Yeah, sure. So the first point to look at is a stamp duty land tax, especially with non-residents buying property in the UK. You will be looking at 2% surcharge for non-residents, and then there's a 5% surcharge for additional dwellings. So if in scenarios where in this scenario, Mohammed had already had other residential dwellings in the UK, so we were essentially looking at 2% plus the 5% additional surcharge. That's the first aspect to look at. Then ATED, that's relevant. I know that's something we will sort of discuss in more detail. But ATED, which is annual tax on annual dwellings, which is an annual charge which would apply to properties that are worth £500,000 or more. Which is quite significant. The property's worth about 15 million. You're looking at the 10 to 20 million range, which is £150,000 of charge every year, which applies to residential dwellings whereby you're not letting the property out to a third party. So dwellings which you'll be occupying personally. ATED is a very significant charge to be aware of.
So is stamp duty a real hurdle in your experience? Does it put off foreign buyers who could invest in a variety of places, or does it just encourage them to think about the long term and buying the right property? How do you find it affects people?
It's more the latter. I mean, we always say tax shouldn't be, tax is something, of course, it's extremely important. It shouldn't really drive decision in the sense that if you are interested in investing, then it shouldn't put you off. So we don't necessarily see decisions being driven by it, but it's more a case of ensuring that the right advice is given to clients.
You mentioned ATED. That would apply depending on the structure through which the property was acquired.
Correct.
So how are you seeing that? How does that make an impact in terms of how people acquire property such as this?
Absolutely. So with ATED charges, the structure does matter because if you own the property personally, ATED is not relevant at all. It's only if the property is owned via corporate structure. And it only applies where the property is not let out on the open market. So in this scenario, because the property was being used by the family for their own personal use, ATED was a relevant point. So in this sort of scenario, essentially to avoid ATED, you should, the property was essentially acquired personally by the client. But it does, so, in scenarios where that isn't the case, where the property is part of an investment portfolio, then we do look at, ATED wouldn't be a relevant point anyway. And in those scenarios, it's more common to see properties being acquired through companies.
Thank you. And looking ahead at the eventual disposal, what would Mohammed's exposure be to capital gains tax?
Yeah, so if the property is owned personally, and in a scenario the property was acquired personally by Mohammed, the capital gains tax exposure would be based on the purchase price of the property at the point when it was acquired, versus you then compare that to how much the property goes up in value by, and that will be a personal exposure to Mohammed, and it will be the gain will be taxed at 24%.
An inheritance tax applies at 40%
yes.
In this country. How do clients invest to structure for that potential liability?
Yes, so The fact that the property is owned in the UK, regardless of whether the property is owned personally or via corporate structure, inheritance tax would be a relevant exposure anyway. So unfortunately, the rules, based on the old rules, you could have previously acquired property through an offshore company and get around inheritance tax, but those rules were changed. So back in 2017 for residential properties. So unfortunately, you cannot get around inheritance tax just by acquiring property to an offshore company. So it's a very relevant point, and unfortunately a point that a lot of overseas investors are not advised on. And this is where we come in to help our clients structure their assets. So to begin with, there isn't any reliefs available for residential property if you buy, whether you buy personally or through a company. However, there are structures that we can put in place to help reduce the exposures over time.
And do you also see increasing use of life assurance to mitigate or debt on purchase? How do you see some of these practical tools being used?
Absolutely, yeah. So since the changes in rules, we're absolutely seeing a lot of that now, and we work very closely with our wealth planners, financial advisor partners to help our clients get the right insurance products for their inheritance tax exposures. From a tax point of view, purely from us advising our clients, there are structures that we can help our clients put in place, such as family investment companies, which are a very common and very popular structuring tools that are available to clients, where we essentially advise them on implementing essentially freezer share structures where their inheritance tax exposure is frozen at a certain level, and then any future growth in value would then fall in the state of the next generation by giving them future growth in value. That's quite a common one. Trust we do advise on a lot as well. So trust essentially would pass the value on. So any value that goes in the trust falls outside your estate immediately. But there are various other implications to be aware of with trust, which is so it's the ongoing. So it's the immediate tax implication, the lifetime charge that come into play when it comes to putting shares or property in the trust, and then the ongoing 10-year anniversary charges. Again, that's something where clients are very are not, especially overseas investors are not that well versed in and well advised on. So that's where we come in and advise clients.
Foundation structures are popular in the Middle East, particularly where they involve Sharia compliant succession.
Yes.
Is a foundation structure relevant for the acquisition here, or what kind of complications does that add?
Yeah, so with the foundation, it's more important to understand what the legal structure is and what the legal reality is. So it depends on various factors. Firstly, who the beneficiary is, the residency status, versus, and also the jurisdiction where the foundation is based. So depending on the jurisdiction of the foundation, it can either be treated as a trust or a corporate structure. If it's a corporate, then ATID and the high rates of stamp duty land tax to be aware of. And then with foundations, it works well from a commercial point of view. So from a generational from a generational succession planning viewpoint, they can work really well. But from a tax point of view, there are so many factors to consider, depending on ultimately how the foundation is treated, whether it's treated as a corporate or non-corporate.
And we know that Mohammed and the family spending 8 to 10 weeks in London
Yes.
across the year. Why does Mohammed have to be careful with his day count? Why does he need to look at that?
Yes, so purely looking at it from this property's viewpoint, it doesn't actually matter, because this property, because it's UK based, eventually in the future, if it's let out as part of the wider investment portfolio, then it will be subject to corporation tax. If it's a company, income tax, if it continues to be owned personally by Mohammed. From an inheritance tax point of view, again, because it's a UK property, it will be exposed to inheritance tax. However, where Mohammed's residency status will be relevant in the long run would be any international assets, any overseas assets that he owns, income that's generated from those assets. So once he becomes UK resident under the statutory residency test per the UK legislation, then he would need to look at his overall exposure to income tax and inheritance tax. So that's why the day count in the UK would be very important.
Thank you. And Hugh, just coming back to you on renovation investment and return on investment. Mohammed undertook comprehensive renovation here, full structural reconfiguration, hotel grade finishes. But from a value creation perspective, what kind of return on investment should clients expect when they're buying well and undertaking this kind of project?
Well, in this instance, the value add amounted to roughly 10% over and above the gross of his purchase price, buying costs, and renovation costs. We sort of target closer to 15%. That's what we sort of aim for. But it's that sort of range which is, I would say, is realistic. And there's a real opportunity, I would say, in the market to create this sort of uplift in real terms, because in times gone by, you'd be competing with small to medium-sized developers. The 15 to 20% return on investment, that's a classic developer target to create. Because of stamp duty but principally stamp duty, and also the weakness on the sales market, developers are not confident in that 15 to 20% that they need. So there's a real gap. So for private buyers to step in and buy property that needs this level of work is an open window. But of course they don't, because they don't have the team, and they'll sit in Bahrain or in Bangkok or wherever, Singapore, and say, who's going to do it for me? How am I going to do it? So, really that's where we come in.
You've got to be on the ground to execute.
You've got to be on the you have to have the right team and all the rest of it. And I think we get on to talking about the team in a minute, because it does relate to what we were just saying then.
And what kind of timescale are we talking about for these projects?
This whole thing from identifying the property to being completed and moved into was 18 months. The renovation works were give or take a year, which is quite typical for a large-scale redevelopment of an apartment in London. The extra 6 months on top was the process of buying and obtaining the consents.
Yeah, and do tell us more a little bit about your team. How you come, what value you bring with that team to help these projects pass smoothly.
Well, our team at Obbard are what we call the acquisitions and sales side. So that we're finding the properties and overseeing the disposal as and when we're doing that. Then we have our design build side, which is our own interior design, QS, project management, and then we have the two distinct things that I always like to point out: the property management side and the rental side. So we let and manage quite a sizable portfolio now. It's worth about 500 million, I guess, in London, and we let and manage that as people would understand that to be. It's a fairly straightforward role, but we asset manage, and that to me is always the missing piece when you come to the residential market. And I'll give you an example of where asset management comes in, is that when you're talking about tax planning, tax reporting, and working with wealth managers and the accountants and the tax advisors, it's only as good as the information they're provided with. So for example, when you do a major renovation and you buy a property for 15 million, you spend 4 million pounds on the renovation, you need those costs to be documented, because those are offset against capital gains down the line. When it comes to income, you need to offset every maintenance bill and whatever, all these things. So where this process gets quite fragmented is if you were not to go and find a company such as ourselves, and you came to London and you were looking to acquire a property, you might go to an agent. They will sell you that property. They might then say, our lettings department can rent you that property. They won't be able to do the design build side, but they might say, I know an architect or a builder or what have you. But none of those parties communicate and speak as a cohesive team. So, and within a large agency, the property manager will not have any communication with the letting agent, who will not have any knowledge of who was the sales agent who sold the property. There will be no interaction with the accountants and all the rest of it. This is all part and parcel of the asset management and the picture that is all managed and retained for the client. So the tax reporting and the tax planning can be as efficient as possible.
And what about on the lending side? I mean, we were discussing with Zeeshan that more clients are looking at using debt on acquisition.
Yep.
Anecdotally, do you see clients using debt? What impact then does that have on returns? What's your assessment?
As a tool to mitigate against inheritance tax, it's obviously very impactful. Borrowing costs, there was a nasty spike, which is now reversing somewhat. The lender appetite remains pretty strong. I mean, we deal with several banks regularly, like Coots, HSBC, Royal Bank of Canada, to name three. They have a very positive lending approach to London, and there are quite a few in the Middle East as well. So I would say the appetite is there, and in fact, we're noticing a bit more competition on rates between lenders. But it certainly is an effective tool, and at times, of course, when capital growth returns, it does amplify the returns quite obviously.
And Zeeshan, just bringing you back in from a tax perspective, all this renovation expenditure that Hugh referenced, why is this important for the capital gains tax position? What should they be thinking in respect of it?
Yeah, so it's critical that all the relevant records are kept because at the point in the future when the property is sold, the relevant expenses in relation to improvements and enhancement expenditure can then be offset when it comes to calculating the capital gains tax exposure and the capital gains tax liability.
What kind of time frame are we talking about then? How long should records be kept? I mean, it's what sort of window over which would HMRC potentially look?
Yeah, so typically, there isn't really a set time frame. So in terms of record keeping, we would recommend that they are at least the electronic records are kept right from the period of ownership of the property really.
And Hugh, just looking at the portfolio development strategy, we mentioned on the top this is one acquisition, but Mohammed's open to making more. What's your advice to families around the portfolio approach? Should they think about multiple family use properties, add investment properties, mix of both? Where do you start the conversation?
It's a broad conversation. My starting point is always start with the strategy being determined by the opportunity put in front of you, rather than perhaps say, I want a bit of this, a bit of that, and a bit of the other, which is not a bad thing to discuss. But basically, I would spend my money based on the opportunities that are put in front of me. So if there's a compelling opportunity, it might not be what I set out to look. So talking about whether you're going to buy a building of 10 apartments rather than 2 very expensive apartments in Mayfair, say, you look at each on their own merits. I mean, once you start looking into building up a portfolio and you're looking at a larger number of properties, the tax thing comes back into play again. That the rationale for using a corporate structure comes back into play. You get advantages, for example, if you're buying multiple units, you get a commercial rate of stamp duty. So instead of paying 18% on a high value property in Mayfair, you could end up paying 5% on buying 6 or 8 units collectively. The ability, I won't go into great detail, this is for others to talk about, but when you're buying in a corporate structure, you can offset your mortgage debt, which you can't do in a personal level. You pay corporation tax, and you can roll up your gains, etc. So these are all the things which have their own specific merits, dependent on the long-term objectives.
And at what point does managing the UK property portfolio, in this case from Riyadh, but really anywhere internationally, become complex? Where do you need to have someone really on the ground, or what's your view?
To me, it's not complex, but it can appear complex when you're dealing with so many different people who are giving you nuggets of advice and they're not all knitting together. So this is why I place so much emphasis on the team. I mean, the law firms we deal with who do the original conveyancing, we work very close with. The lenders, we like to work very close with. The tax advisors, we like to work the wealth managers. So if everybody is speaking more or less with one voice, and that voice basically meaning this is for the client, then the objectives are usually met. When the client feels that I've got to put boots on the ground, i.e. get involved, that is usually when the system's got fragmented. I'm going to London to meet my letting manager, I'm going to London to meet my wealth manager, and I'm going to, basically, if there is a coordinated team, then the client will get the outcomes that they're after.
So it's having the right partners, getting the right virtual team of people communicating.
About the right people that are the right advice.
And Zeeshan, just on the tax and structuring point, at what portfolio value or number of properties does structuring conversation kind of fundamentally shift, and what are the opportunities that arise from that?
Yeah, so for us really, it's not, when it comes to tax advice, it's not about the value or the number of properties really. Ultimately, it's more about where where the client is in the life cycle, what the client's long-term objectives are. So, whether it's a £15 million property portfolio or £5 million property portfolio, it's more about, tax is relevant regardless, because anything above the inheritance tax threshold will be subject to inheritance tax, let's say. It's about what the client's succession planning, strategies are, where the client wants to go, in terms of the family dynamics, where does the client want the asset portfolio to ultimately, who he wants or she wants the property portfolio to be inherited by. That then drives what structures we put in place for the client. A lot of the time it's about having those conversations about, because for us, what then drives our tax strategies are what the client's commercial objectives are first. So we always sit down with the clients, because this is all bespoke planning. This is not, it's not a one size fit all approach for us. So it's about understanding the client's objectives and then helping that then drive the tax strategies that we implement for clients.
Because the multi-generational planning is important. We know we've got 2 kids coming to university in the UK. They could easily end up staying in London on the longer term. So how do they table those conversations, I suppose, more broader conversations, not just looking at the property, but other assets as part of a succinct wealth plan?
Yeah, so if, in this scenario, the kids will, the plan is for the kids to come to the UK, for higher education. In the long term, it's important to then consider whether they will become UK residents. So if they're going to be in the UK, that coupled with what the long-term objects, so if with our clients' long-term, also wider property portfolio, the intention is for the kids to then be involved in the portfolio in the long run. So then it's about us working with the client to then ensure that the right structures are put in place from day one, with the kids, and ultimately, there is a risk that they might become UK residents in the future. How does that then impact the overall tax position when it comes to the wider portfolio and in future international assets that the family will own? So residency planning then becomes very important. Domiciliary is not relevant anymore because of the change to the domiciliary rules last year. So now we're looking at the foreign and income gains rules, where once you're a long-term UK resident, then you can't claim, you are then subject to income tax on your worldwide assets, so you can't claim remittance basis anymore. So all these conversations then have to be had with the family to understand it, and advise them on their tax position.
So Hugh, just for some concluding thoughts, really, looking back on this transaction, what are some of the key insights? What's the practical applications here that people should take away?
The team. I think you need to get the right team together. I think you need to understand your objectives and discuss that with each of the relevant parties within that team. So your wealth planning, your structures, and from the property side with your buying agent, should you choose to appoint one. I think having if you then are looking at the strategy that you feel suits your objectives, who's going to execute that strategy? And very much so that brings you to redeveloping or refurbishing a property. And then think of the practicalities and the long-term holding of that property. If you're going to, like someone like Mohammed is going to spend 10 weeks a year, what are you going to do with that property in the other 40-odd weeks? And also, we touched on how you mentioned how long do you keep records? Well, actually, they have to be kept until they're needed. So we talked about keeping records of costs to offset capital gains side. But then you have building control certificates, you have before and after plans, you have to, the information that a future buyer may need. Someone's got to collect all that. And so having a professional partner who is with you along the entire journey, and obviously this is legacy planning, it could be passed on, but if it is passed on, it should be passed on in a package.
Thank you very much, Hugh. And Zeeshan, from a tax and structuring perspective, what's your top tip for buyers from the Gulf looking at prime central London property?
Yeah, so the biggest issue that we see, especially with overseas investors, is the lack of awareness around inheritance tax. Because previously the rules were different. So if you own property through an offshore company, you could have avoided inheritance tax. Those rules changed almost 9 years ago. But there is still a lack of awareness around that. Inheritance tax is, of course, a big, is a very relevant point. And there's, ultimately, even if you own property through an offshore company now, you can't get around inheritance tax. Immediately, however, there are structures that we can put in place which can then reduce the inheritance tax exposure in the long run. So the advice would be to appoint specialist advisors early on so that the right structures can be put in place from day one.
Well, thank you for talking to me today, and we look forward to sharing this case study.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.